All right, this is going to be the first PowerPoint lecture for Chapter 6. The title of this PowerPoint lecture is American History, Unit 3, Lecture 1, The New Government. Washington as president. So in 1789, George Washington was unanimously selected as the first president of the United States. And he had the task of creating a new government for scratch. So meaning there was no voting going on. The citizens did not vote him in. He was unanimously selected to be our first president. And he was not affiliated with any political party. Political parties weren't necessarily around yet. And I say yet because we will get to that here very shortly. Congress as at work. So one of the first things they did, Congress, was pass that Bill of Rights. If you remember, we ended the other chapter with the Anti-Federalists telling the Federalists that they would agree to ratify the Constitution so long as there was a Bill of Rights that was added on afterwards. And the Federalists did promise that to the Anti-Federalists. So that was one of the first things that they did was pass the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Another thing that Congress did was pass the Judiciary Act of 1789. This established the Supreme Court, the district courts, and the courts of appeals. So essentially, this established the judiciary branch, the judicial branch of the United States. Also, Congress did create and establish departments for the executive branch called executive departments. The first three departments that they created was the Department of State, the Department of War, and the Department of Treasury. We do have two of these three departments still with us today. The Department of State and the Department of Treasury are still there today, and they assist with helping the president make decisions. George Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State, so he would be in charge of the State Department. What the State Department does is they take care of foreign affairs. Every president will appoint heads or what are called secretaries of their certain department. So George Washington did appoint John Knox as the Department of War. We do not have a Department of War today. We have a Secretary of Defense, which was kind of what the Department of War did. They deal with, obviously, defense. They deal with the military, going to war, not going to war, those sorts of things. The Department of Treasury, the head of the Department of Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, appointed by George Washington, and they obviously deal with money, and we do still have that department today. Today, the executive departments that help out the president, there are quite a few of them. Offhand, I don't know exactly how many. I would say between 15 and 20 different departments that range between dealing with national parks, deal with transportation, commerce, those types of things. So all of those are called executive departments and help out the president. George Washington at work, like I said, he established what were called precedents as president. Okay, what precedents are? A precedent is when someone sets a precedent, that means people that follow, and in this case, people that follow the president or soon-to-be presidents will usually do the same things that he did. For example, George Washington created a cabinet, and he created heads of departments to advise. People followed along in his footsteps and did the same thing. When there's a switchover of power, the new president can then select his own heads of the departments to help him make decisions, and the people left over from the other presidency usually leave. Okay, he defined appointment powers, meaning that the president does appoint or select a lot of people in positions within his cabinet, which we just talked about, or the departments, but also he appoints leaders to are ambassadors to other countries. He does appoint judges and those types of things. So George Washington kind of set that precedent. He is also a legislative leader. We obviously know that Congress is the legislative branch and creates the laws, but the president can help Congress or help navigate bills or suggest bills that could possibly be laws, and he does affect legislation a little bit. George Washington did set the precedent that a president should only serve 2 terms, or a total of 8 years. They do not have to be back to back. Most likely, usually they are back to back years, 4 years, and then another 4 years. However, they do not have to be back to back. President Washington, George Washington, left after 8 years because he thought that it was important that the United States doesn't establish a monarchy where someone stays in power for long periods of time, like that of Great Britain. So he thought that was very important. And the president is obviously conducts foreign affairs, or talks with other countries, and deals with a lot of things across the world. All right, so I talked about Alexander Hamilton. He was the Secretary of Treasury, head of the Department of Treasury, and he was obviously concerned about money and was concerned about the economic survival of the country. So what he did was he created a plan for the funding and assumption of debt as a country. So what he suggested was that the United States needed to establish a national bank. So this national bank was very controversial. We do not have a national bank today. If you think about the banks that are out there, banks are either run by state governments, like, for example, the State Employees Credit Union of North Carolina, or banks are privately owned businesses, or they're their own entity. Think of Wells Fargo, PNC Bank. Those banks were created by people, by businessmen and women, and they're their own entity. There is no national bank today that is run by the United States government. However, back then there was, okay? Now, people thought that this was an unhealthy relationship between the wealthy and government. People thought that the United States government should not run a bank because they thought the wealthy people in D.C. would have an unfair advantage, and they also, people who were opposed to the national bank, thought that it was unconstitutional. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say about establishing a bank. Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State at the time, and he leads opposition to the national bank, and we see a split in Washington's cabinet, meaning some people sided with Alexander Hamilton and the creation of a national bank, and some people sided with Thomas Jefferson and thought that that wasn't a good idea. Although George Washington reluctantly approves that there should be a bank. So this kind of starts, becoming a big problem in the cabinet because there is a disagreement within the cabinet ranks. You have Alexander Hamilton, who I just said, who was in favor of a national bank. He has backers, or has a group called the Federalists, which were very similar to the Federalists that we just talked about with the Constitution. And him and his quote-unquote party, okay, thought that the central government should be powerful and that there should be a loose interpretation when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. And he was in favor, and they were in favor of a national bank. They were also in favor of manufacturing. They were in favor of business and trade and commerce. They favored England, even though we had just beaten England in the Revolutionary War. They thought that we should become allies with England, and they did not like becoming allies with the country of France. and most of their supporters were in the North. So that kind of goes hand to hand with manufacturing. A lot of the manufacturing and business and commerce and trade happened in the North. On the other side, Thomas Jefferson and quote unquote his political party that starts to emerge, they call themselves the Democratic Republicans, which would be kind of obviously a little confusing in today's terms. But they favored strong state governments. They wanted a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and they were anti-national bank. They were pro-farming. They were in favor of being friends with France over England, and most of their supporters were obviously in the South and in the West. So here is where we see the separation of the two political parties start to form. Very early on in the creation of our nation. And here you have Alexander Hamilton on the left and Thomas Jefferson on the right. So, establishing sovereignty. A few things were happening at this time in the country. A big thing that happened, or a big event that happened, was called the Whiskey Rebellion. This was a rebellion over, obviously, whiskey tax in Pennsylvania. Farmers in and around Pittsburgh, or the western part of Pennsylvania, were upset that their whiskey and their wheat and rye were being taxed. In order to make whiskey, you got to have wheat or rye. And what happened was the national government put down the rebellion. And the big thing here, the big takeaway, is to show how much power the government has. George Washington actually got troops together and started marching towards Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. The farmers got wind that George Washington was on his way, so they kind of stopped rebelling with that. Jay's Treaty was a widely unpopular trade treaty that was signed with Great Britain. Piccaninny's Treaty was a treaty that was signed with Spain to open up the Mississippi River to shipping. At the time, Spain did hold control of what is present-day Mexico. They held some of the waters in the Gulf of Mexico. If you remember, we did buy Florida from Spain, so we needed to have Spain as an ally, and we had some trade deals with them as well. The French Revolution actually occurred shortly after the American Revolution, and if you remember, the French did in fact help the United States win the American Revolution, and the United States does support France in the beginning of the Revolution. And if you remember from world history, the French Revolution was kind of complicated, but basically the commoners were rebelling against the elite class, and once the French Rebellion starts to turn bloody, where they start to send people to the guillotine, if you remember Maximilien Robespierre, he was a big rebel against the elite ruling class in France, and they were basically just sending a lot of people to the guillotine, and that's when the Americans kind of stepped away and said we weren't going to support anybody in the French Revolution. Remember, France and Britain are always at war with each other, and the United States decides to be neutral, meaning they don't take a side when war sparks back up between France and Britain. Another treaty that they signed, or that we signed, the United States signed, was a Treaty of Greenville, and it opened up the Ohio River Valley region to settlement after defeating Native Americans at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So this was a treaty that was signed with the Native Americans in the Ohio region. Washington walks away. If you remember, I did say that Washington did not serve a third term, so he served 2 terms, which was a total of 8 years, 4 years for each. He wrote a famous farewell warning when he left office, and in this farewell warning, and you can read it, it's a primary source reading, he talks about 2 important things. He first talks about not getting into foreign affairs, meaning he doesn't think that the United States should take sides when it comes to wars in Europe. So, and we did that. France and Great Britain were at war with each other, and the United States didn't take a side. So that was kind of foreshadowing, as far as, he told, or he tried to explain to the American people that, we should not, invest our interests in foreign affairs as far as war goes. It's okay to trade with them, but to leave them and to the fighting to those countries in Europe. He also was very against political parties. He thought that political parties were very divisive or separated the country, which they did. And I think, in today's terms, that couldn't be any more correct, that, political parties have somewhat divided the nation throughout the years. He was not in favor of any political parties. But political parties had already begun to take shape: Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party.